The room was too quiet for what happened next. That's the first thing Kaitlyn Greenidge realized as she stepped across the polished wooden floor of the New York townhouse, her notebook tucked under her arm. The kind of quiet that didn't feel natural. The kind of quiet that felt arranged, curated, staged, like someone had paused the world and was waiting for applause before they pressed play again. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And then it happened. A single voice shattered the silence with the force of a trumpet blast. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. Not whispered, not politely announced. Declared, as if an audience of hundreds had gathered. As if velvet curtains had just parted. As if a royal court were waiting in breathless anticipation. But there were only 3 people in the room. Kaitlyn, Meghan, and the house manager, whose spine was so straight it looked like he trained at Buckingham Palace. Why would someone announce royalty when the audience consisted of 2 women and an employee? Who was that performance for? And what did it reveal about what was coming? Tell me something. If you walked into a room and someone greeted you with your full name, middle name, job title, and the meaning of your astrological chart, would you feel honored, or would you feel like you had just stepped into a play you weren't given the script for? Because that's exactly how Kaitlyn felt. Like she had wandered into Act 2 of a drama she didn't audition for. Meghan looked up, wearing the kind of smile that doesn't fully reach the eyes, the kind of smile that tests the other person for weaknesses. A smile that attempts warmth but shields something sharper behind it. "Thank you, Charles," Meghan said softly to the house manager, her eyes never leaving Kaitlyn. And that was when Kaitlyn understood. The introduction wasn't for Meghan. It was for her. A reminder. A warning. A silent message that hovered in the air like perfume. You are not speaking to a celebrity. You are not speaking to an actress. You are not speaking to a philanthropist or a podcaster or a public figure. You are speaking to a duchess. Or, in Meghan's mind, something even higher. Have you ever met someone who needs control the way most people need air? Someone who needs to feel elevated to feel secure? Someone who tests you before you've said your first sentence? That was the energy in the room. Thick, heavy, pressurized. Kaitlyn stepped forward, hand extended, voice steady. "Nice to meet you, Meghan." It should have been simple. A standard human interaction. 2 adults greeting each other. But the moment the word Meghan left her mouth, the temperature dropped. Not literally, but emotionally. Like someone had opened a window in December. Meghan's smile flickered. Just slightly. Barely there. But enough. And in that tiny flicker, that half-second of glitching composure, Kaitlyn saw something she couldn't quite name. Something like frustration. Or pride. Or disappointment that her title had dissolved into thin air before it could gain momentum. Meghan studied her. Then said, slowly, pointedly, "I prefer your Highness." There it was. The moment that would become the center of the storm. The moment that would echo long after the interview ended. The moment Kaitlyn would later describe as surreal. Your Highness. Not in a palace. Not in a car surrounded by security. Not at a formal banquet. Not in front of cameras or diplomats or any crowd where titles set the tone. But here, in a living room, with 3 people, a pot of untouched tea, and a tension so thick it might as well have been a 4th person. The house manager didn't flinch. He stood behind Meghan, hands clasped, eyes lowered, like this demand was routine. But Kaitlyn, she blinked. Your Highness? To a woman who had left royal duties? To someone sitting on a sofa in New York wearing slippers and a perfectly arranged cardigan? Tell me, what would you have said? Would you have played along? Would you have laughed it off? Would you have corrected her? Would you have apologized? Or would you, like Kaitlyn, have stood your ground? Because that moment wasn't about etiquette. It wasn't about tradition. And it certainly wasn't about respect. It was about power. And Meghan wanted to know if she still had it. The interview hadn't even started, and already Kaitlyn was being tested. The air around them felt electric, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Meghan waited, eyes fixed, shoulders squared. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was expectation. The expectation that her title would orbit the room like a satellite, that it would be honored, respected, worshipped even in private settings. And Kaitlyn felt it, the weight of the request. The absurdity of it. The vulnerability of it. Because demanding to be called Your Highness didn't make Meghan powerful. It made her exposed. It revealed something raw beneath the polished exterior. Insecurity? Longing? Identity slipping from her fingertips? What do you think it was? Kaitlyn chose honesty. I think Meghan is fine. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't smirk. She simply answered. And the room reacted. Meghan's expression froze. The house manager stiffened like a guard dog who heard an unfamiliar noise. And for a moment, a long, heavy, stretching moment, no one moved. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Not in Meghan's script. The interview was arranged. The presentation was arranged. The introduction was arranged. And now the form of address was supposed to be arranged too. But Kaitlyn had rewritten the script with a single sentence. A crack appeared. Small. Fine. Hairline. Barely visible. But once a crack exists, the entire structure becomes unpredictable. Meghan leaned back slightly, examining her interviewer again as if seeing her for the first time. Okay, Meghan said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. Shall we begin? But the interview hadn't begun. Not really. Because in that single exchange, that short moment of resistance, the dynamic had changed. The conversation ahead would not be standard, comfortable, or predictable. Something had shifted. A tension had been born. A spark had landed on dry kindling. And what happens when tension meets expectation? When control meets resistance? When identity meets pushback? It creates conflict. And behind Meghan's careful smile, behind her graceful posture, behind the polished Hollywood perfect charm, that conflict simmered. Waiting for the moment it would break open. What happened next would shape the rest of the interview. What happened next would expose insecurities no royal title could protect. What happened next would turn an ordinary magazine discussion into a moment neither woman would forget. And what happened next? Well, that's where everything begins to unravel. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It wasn't the quiet that happens between two people thinking. It was the quiet of a stage light turning on. The quiet of a camera lens focusing. The quiet of an actress preparing for her close-up. And Meghan, fictionalized, dramatized Meghan, lifted her chin just a fraction higher. Like someone adjusting an invisible crown that only she could feel. Kaitlyn noticed it. Of course she did. You would have noticed it too. Anyone paying attention would have seen that something underneath the polished exterior had cracked, even if only by an inch. But here's the unsettling thing. A single inch is enough for a whole avalanche to escape. As Meghan gestured toward the sofa, inviting Kaitlyn to sit, there was a new tension in the air, something unspoken, like both women were waiting to see who would make the next move. And the house manager, who had become a piece of furniture the moment he finished his ceremonial introduction, lingered just close enough to intervene if needed. Why? To protect whom? From what? Those questions hovered around them the way dust dances in sunlight, invisible until someone looks closely. Kaitlyn sat. Meghan didn't. Not immediately. Instead, she paced. Just a small step to the left. A pause. Then another tiny step to the right. If you've ever seen someone internally rearranging their emotions, trying to fit frustration back into a polite shape, you would have recognized this immediately. Because the fictional version of Meghan wasn't pacing for herself. She was pacing for the room, for the performance, for the dynamic she needed to restore. She finally lowered herself into the chair opposite Kaitlyn, crossing her legs with immaculate poise. "Thank you for coming," Meghan said, voice smooth to perfection. "I appreciate interviewers who respect my work." And Kaitlyn responded with the kind of journalistic neutrality that has disarmed far more intimidating personalities. "That's what I'm here for. Your experiences, not your titles. Your experiences, not your titles." A simple sentence, but one with teeth. And those teeth caught something deep in Meghan. Her posture stiffened. Her eyes narrowed. Just subtly, just enough. Her breath caught for half a second before smoothing out again. Because what does someone cling to when they feel their identity slipping? What does someone emphasize when they fear being forgotten? What does someone insist on when they feel they are no longer seen the way they once were? Titles. Status. Symbols. Things that can be spoken aloud to fill a quiet room with importance. But that's exactly what Kaitlyn stripped away with one calm, steady sentence. And it left Meghan, even in this fictional retelling, suspended between two versions of herself, the one she wanted to be and the one she feared she was becoming. Meghan crossed her arms gently, a gesture easy to overlook, but not for someone like Kaitlyn, who had spent years studying human behavior through interviews. Before we dive in, Meghan said, "I'd just appreciate it if we maintain the proper address. It helps keep things consistent." Consistent with what? Kaitlyn wondered, but she didn't say it aloud. Instead, she asked, "Consistent in what way?" It was a reasonable question. It was a gentle challenge. It was a test of clarity and credibility. But Meghan heard it differently. She heard defiance. She heard refusal. She heard someone stepping out of the script she had prepared. And you could feel the temperature in the room change again. Meghan uncrossed her legs, sat a little straighter, smiled with every corner of her face except her eyes. "It's simple," she replied. "I earned my title. I expect it to be used." Earned. That word carried weight. It sank between them like a stone. Earned through marriage? Through ceremony? Through service? Through hardship? Titles aren't simple. But Meghan said it was simple. And expecting Kaitlyn to agree was like expecting the tide to stop at the edge of a sandcastle. Kaitlyn took a breath. "Meghan, I'm here to interview you as a person, not a title. If you'd prefer a different type of conversation, I'm happy to adjust or reschedule." Reschedule. Another simple word with complicated consequences. Because to most people, rescheduling is practical. To Meghan, in this fictional narrative, it sounded like something else entirely. Rejection. Boundary. Loss of control. Her lips parted, closed, opened again. The performance she wore like armor slipped. And that's when the emotions started leaking through the cracks. Not enough to break the moment, but enough to expose its undercurrent. "Are you refusing?" Meghan asked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry, not yet. But it was sharp, like a blade laid flat across a table. Kaitlyn shook her head. "I'm clarifying. Clarifying." Another neutral word that felt like a challenge when layered onto a conversation already unraveling. In that instant, the house manager stepped forward, hands clasped as if he'd been trained to anticipate tension. He addressed Kaitlyn. "The Duchess's title is important. It should." She stopped him with a raised hand. "No, Charles. Let me handle this." And there it was again, that royal cadence in her voice, crisp enough to slice the air. A cadence that made the room feel smaller, tighter, heavier. Meghan leaned forward. "Let me put it this way. If you were interviewing a queen, would you refuse to acknowledge her? A queen, not a duchess. A queen. An interesting choice of comparison, don't you think? Why not actress? Why not advocate? Why not philanthropist? Why not podcaster or producer or public figure? Why elevate herself beyond her station? Or was that the point? Because sometimes people say what they wish they were. Sometimes they reveal their desires without meaning to. Sometimes they reach for symbols that make them feel whole. Kaitlyn met her gaze evenly. If she asked me to call her Your Highness in a private room with no formal setting, yes, I would still decline. The finality of the statement hit Meghan like a cold wind. Her face went still. Her breath tightened. Her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her dress. And then, the smallest tremor of her eyelid. Barely there. Almost invisible, but a tremor nonetheless. If you've ever watched someone attempt to regain control of a spiraling moment, that flicker of emotion fighting to stay beneath the surface, then you know what it looks like. The fictional Meghan swallowed, then forced a smile. "Well," she said quietly, "I suppose we're starting off strong." It was meant to sound light. It didn't. There are moments in life when you feel the ground shift, not violently, but unmistakably. As if something underneath the conversation has tilted, and you're suddenly aware that the next step could determine everything. This was one of those moments. Because the interview had not yet begun, the recorder wasn't on. The first question hadn't been asked, and already they were in conflict. Already the emotional stakes had risen. Already pride, power, and identity were swirling through the air like invisible dust. The moment felt suspended, fragile, balanced on the thinnest wire. And here's the thing about wires. They don't stay still for long. As the tension stretched between them, as Meghan tried to recalibrate her authority and Kaitlyn tried to protect her professionalism, as the house manager hovered like a silent sentinel, something else began forming in the space between them. Something no one intended, but everyone felt. A spark. The spark that starts every unraveling, every confrontation, every emotional explosion. Because when two worlds collide, when expectation meets resistance, when someone protects their dignity against someone else's demands, there is only one possible outcome. Something breaks. You can feel it, can't you? The pressure rising. The unspoken words building. The emotional dam straining. The beginning of a story that won't stay polite, no matter how deeply Meghan tries to smooth the surface. And the truth is, this was only the beginning. The moment that came next, the moment that would ignite everything, was still waiting in the shadows. And it was far, far bigger than a title. Because what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment Kaitlyn Greenidge stepped inside the New York townhouse, she felt it. That strange heaviness in the air, that thick, velvet-like tension that didn't match the elegant decor or the soft lighting. It was the kind of feeling that makes your instincts sit up before your brain even knows what's wrong. You felt it before, haven't you? Walking into a room and instantly sensing that something is off. Something staged. Something unnatural. That was this room. Quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not reading a book quiet. Not sipping tea on a sunny afternoon quiet. This was curated quiet. Like someone had walked through the house 10 minutes earlier and manually dialed the noise level down to 0. And then, out of nowhere, came the announcement. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. The voice rang out with theatrical enthusiasm, and Kaitlyn almost expected curtains to pull open behind her. She turned, half expecting a throne, a spotlight, a dramatic entrance with orchestral music swelling in the background. But no, just a living room. Soft rug, polished floors. 3 people standing in a triangle of awkward tension. Her, the house manager, and Meghan Markle herself. Why would someone announce royalty like that, when the only people present already knew each other's names? Who was the performance for? Was this part of the brand? Part of the persona? Part of some ritual designed to elevate the atmosphere? Or was it something deeper, a glimpse into a hidden need? Ask yourself honestly. If you were in that room, what would you have thought? Would you have laughed internally? Would you have felt nervous? Would you have wondered whether you had accidentally wandered onto a movie set? Kaitlyn felt a dozen emotions at once, but she played it cool. The way seasoned journalists do when stepping into unpredictable territory. She'd interviewed politicians, celebrities, authors, activists. She'd seen egos of every size, shape, and temperature. But this was new. The house manager stood stiffly, hands clasped, chin lifted as if he were presenting the Queen of England herself. His posture didn't belong in a Manhattan townhouse. It belonged in a marble hall echoing with centuries of tradition. It was surreal. It was jarring. It was performative. Meghan sat on the sofa, perfectly composed, expression calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. As if dramatic introductions were part of her daily routine. "Thank you, Charles," she said quietly, not once glancing at him. Not once acknowledging that the gesture was odd. Not once acting as though the moment was anything less than completely normal. That subtle detachment, the casual acceptance of ritual, was almost more shocking than the announcement itself. Kaitlyn's first instinct? Take mental notes. Because interviews don't begin with the first question. They begin the moment you step through the door. They begin before you even sit down. They begin with the atmosphere, the body language, the unsaid things. This interview had begun the second Meghan's title filled the room. Kaitlyn forced a polite smile, stepping forward with an extended hand. "Nice to meet you, Meghan." And that was the moment the atmosphere shifted. A flicker, a pause, a glitch in the performance. Meghan's expression tightened. Barely, subtly, but undeniably. The smile she had been wearing froze for a fraction of a second. Her eyelids lowered ever so slightly. Her body straightened by an inch. Did she hear the name? Oh yes, she heard it, and she didn't like it. Tell me something. Have you ever said a completely normal sentence and instantly known the other person didn't approve? Not because they said anything, but because something in their face told the truth before their words did? That was what happened here. Meghan inhaled softly, as if steadying herself. "Actually," she said, voice gentle, controlled, deliberate. "I prefer your Highness." Time stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally. The air froze. The room stiffened. The house manager lifted his chin higher, as if bracing for Kaitlyn's response. "Your Highness. Not Your Grace. Not Duchess Meghan. Not Duchess of Sussex. Your Highness." A title typically reserved for working royals. A title embedded in centuries of protocol. A title that functioned within palace walls, not living rooms. But Meghan said it like she expected it. Like it was owed to her. Like it was the only acceptable option. Kaitlyn blinked. Just once. Slowly. Then she smiled. I think Meghan is fine. And for the second time, everything in the room shifted. This time, the shift was sharper, like a taut string pulled even tighter, like a glass that develops a hairline crack, like a storm cloud forming behind someone's stare. Meghan's composure wavered again, not visibly enough to call it anger. Not yet. But controlled frustration? Yes. Because this wasn't about respect. It wasn't about politeness. It wasn't about etiquette. It was about dominance. And Kaitlyn's refusal, polite, steady, neutral, had punctured the power structure Meghan was trying to establish. The fictional version of Meghan leaned back slightly, folding her hands in her lap. Of course, she said, though her voice had thinned by a fraction. If that's how you'd like to do it. But I was under the impression that. Kaitlyn cut in gently. I'm here to interview you as a person, not a title. I hope that's all right. That sentence hung in the air like incense. As a person, not a title. Was that an insult? Was it a boundary? Was it a reminder? Depends on who you ask. For Meghan, in this story, it was a challenge. Her lips parted. Her eyebrows lifted. Her expression sharpened. For just a moment, a very brief, very human moment, the mask slipped. And beneath the curated calm, something insecure flickered. Was it fear of irrelevance? Fear of disrespect? Fear of being ordinary? Because here's a truth people rarely admit. It's not the fall from power that hurts. It's the loss of how people treat you. When you're used to reverence, neutrality feels like disrespect. When you're used to deference, equality feels like insult. Kaitlyn didn't say anything more. She didn't push. She didn't escalate. She simply waited. And that waiting became another form of pressure. The house manager stepped forward again, voice tight, ready to intervene. The Duchess prefers. Meghan shot him a look. A quick, cutting glance that sliced him into silence. No, Charles. Let me handle this. Kaitlyn watched all of it, seeing not just the communication but the choreography, the dynamic, the hierarchy, the unspoken rules. And here's where the story deepens. This wasn't about a title. This was about control. Control over the room. Control over the narrative. Control over how she was perceived. Meghan exhaled slowly. Well, let's begin, she said. But Kaitlyn wasn't fooled. Because the interview hadn't begun at all. What had begun was much more telling. The power game. Meghan gestured toward the sofa, and Kaitlyn sat, notebook on her lap, recorder in hand. Meghan stayed standing a moment longer, as if deciding whether she would descend to the same physical level as Kaitlyn. Then, gracefully, slowly, she sat. Her posture perfect. Her face serene. But her eyes? Stormy. Tell me, Kaitlyn, when you write about women, do you consider how titles protect us? Kaitlyn paused. A question wrapped in implication. Protect? Interesting word choice. She answered carefully. I consider how transparency protects us more. Meghan tilted her head, the motion small but loaded. That single hum said everything. It said, you challenged me. I felt it. And I don't like it. The interview was off to a rocky start. But rocky starts don't always lead to disaster. Sometimes they lead to revelations. Sometimes they lead to breaking points. Sometimes they lead to moments that define everything that follows. Meghan crossed her legs. Her foot bounced once, then stopped, as if she remembered someone was watching. Kaitlyn noticed, because journalists always notice. And the room felt even tighter, the air even heavier, the silence even sharper. Because Meghan wasn't just being interviewed. She was being observed, and she knew it. That's when she asked the question that would send the entire interview spiraling. Before we continue, are you refusing to acknowledge my title? There it was. The spark that ignites every fire. The pressure point. The line crossed. And Kaitlyn answered with the same calm she had carried since she stepped into the room. I'm choosing to address you the way you introduced yourself at the beginning of your public career. As Meghan. The fictional version of Meghan tightened her jaw. Just slightly. Just enough. The house manager looked away, as if trying to disappear into the wallpaper. And something unspoken passed between the two women. A silent standoff, a clash of philosophies, a collision of identities. Because this wasn't about journalism anymore. It was about respect, perception, self-definition. It was about who gets to decide who someone is. Meghan leaned forward. Her voice soft. Controlled. Too controlled. So, you're saying my title means nothing here? Not nothing, Kaitlyn said. Just not required. Meghan nodded once. A single, tight, almost brittle nod. And the temperature dropped 1 more degree. Because now the emotional stakes were set. Meghan wanted elevation. Kaitlyn wanted equality. And those two desires could not exist in the same room. Not peacefully. Not quietly. Not without consequence. What happened next? Well, that was the moment everything truly began to unravel. And the next demand Meghan made, the next shift in her tone, the next twist in the room's energy, would set the stage for the most explosive moment of the entire interview. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The room was quiet, but it no longer felt neutral. It hummed with expectation, an invisible electric current running along the edges of every polished surface. The soft sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed sharper somehow, as if even the light was aware of the tension in the air. Kaitlyn Greenidge sat on the edge of the sofa, notebook poised, pen hovering, aware that this was no ordinary interview. This was an entrance into an unspoken battlefield, and the first demand was about to fall. Meghan leaned forward slightly, elbows resting delicately on her knees, fingers interlaced. Her posture was controlled, precise, like a queen adjusting her gloves before receiving a dignitary. Every movement carried intention. Every gesture carried weight. Every microexpression was a calculated message. Kaitlyn noticed it instantly, because seasoned interviewers see these things before they fully happen. Before we go any further, Meghan said softly, deliberately. Each word rolled out measured, almost musical, but there was steel under the surface. I need you to address me properly. Kaitlyn blinked. Properly? A simple word, seemingly innocent. But in the charged atmosphere of the townhouse, it was explosive. A test. A challenge. A demand veiled in civility. Kaitlyn could feel it in the air. This wasn't a casual request. This was a boundary. A line drawn with invisible ink. And crossing it, or even questioning it, was risky. Properly? Kaitlyn asked, tilting her head slightly. She had learned long ago that tone carries more weight than words. And her tone was neutral, composed, professional. Yes, Meghan replied. Your Highness, that is the proper address. A small, almost imperceptible shiver passed through the house manager, who had been standing perfectly still in the corner like a marble statue. Even he knew the room had shifted. Now it wasn't just an interview. It was a test. And tests, by their nature, reveal more than answers. They reveal character. Kaitlyn could see the subtle panic behind the controlled exterior. A flicker in Meghan's eyes, a tension in her shoulders, a sharp intake of breath barely noticeable. This was not anger yet. It was anticipation, a careful, measured expectation that her demand would be obeyed. Kaitlyn considered her options. She could comply. She could humor the request, call Meghan Your Highness in this intimate setting, and allow the performative ritual to continue unchallenged. She could refuse, maintaining journalistic integrity, and risk immediate tension, or worse, the interview's collapse. Or she could do something more daring, something audacious. Something that could either crack the ice or shatter the fragile equilibrium of the room. Kaitlyn smiled faintly. I'll address you as Meghan, she said. I think that's enough for this interview. The room froze. You could hear the clock ticking. You could almost see the air condense. Even the sunlight seemed to pause, catching on the polished floorboards like a spotlight on a stage. Meghan's lips pressed together. Her eyes narrowed subtly, a challenge flickering in their depths. You think that's enough? She asked, voice calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. Kaitlyn met her gaze evenly. I do, she said. Short, firm, unapologetic. The kind of answer that disarms even the most prepared opponent. Meghan's hands twitched, almost imperceptibly. She was trying to maintain composure, trying to cloak her reaction in the smooth veneer of charm and elegance. But Kaitlyn saw the tension ripple beneath. The faint tremor in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. This was the first real crack. The first subtle sign that Meghan's world, the one she curated meticulously in private and public, had been unsettled. And Kaitlyn realized something. This wasn't about etiquette, not really. This was about control. Meghan had prepared for this interview meticulously. She had considered every question, every potential answer, every nuance of the conversation. But she had not accounted for Kaitlyn's refusal to perform the ritual of reverence. She had expected compliance. She had expected the script to be followed. She had expected her title to orbit the room like a satellite. And now the script was broken. Kaitlyn noticed the subtle shift in Meghan's breathing. A controlled inhale, followed by a deliberate exhale. Every professional gesture was still there. Posture perfect, smile intact, voice measured. But the undercurrent had changed. There was tension in the cadence of her words, in the micro-gestures, in the way her hands flexed slightly on her lap. "You realize," Meghan said slowly, each word deliberate, "that how you address me sets the tone for this conversation?" "Yes," Kaitlyn replied. "Calm, neutral, firm. And I also realize that respect is mutual." A pause. The house manager glanced nervously at Meghan, clearly wondering if intervention was required. But Meghan lifted a hand, a subtle signal to remain silent. She wanted to manage this herself. And so she did. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire townhouse held its breath. A standoff. Two women locked in a silent battle of wills. One representing authority, titles, and performance. The other representing integrity, professionalism, and independence. You've felt tension like this before, haven't you? That strange, almost tangible pressure when two forces meet, when expectations collide and neither side wants to back down. That was the energy now. Meghan leaned forward slightly, just enough for the room to feel smaller. Her voice softened, yet retained a subtle sharpness. "Do you understand what I'm asking?" she said. Kaitlyn nodded. "I understand," she said. "But I also understand my own standards." A beat of silence. And then Meghan tilted her head, just slightly. A small, imperceptible gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "You are testing me," she said. "Perhaps," Kaitlyn replied. "Or perhaps I'm testing you." The words hung in the air like a delicate thread, ready to snap at any moment. For a second, the room felt smaller, tighter, the tension more tangible. And Kaitlyn realized that this was no ordinary interview anymore. This was a negotiation, a psychological duel, a chess match played with words, gestures, and titles. The first demand had been made. The first refusal had been met. And the consequences were already beginning to ripple through the room. Because when someone is used to total control, every refusal is a mirror. And Meghan was staring straight at hers. She shifted slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture. Controlled, perfect, elegant. Yet beneath it, barely visible, there was something else. Anticipation, frustration, a spark of anger. And Kaitlyn, ever observant, could see it, could feel it, could almost hear the unspoken thoughts buzzing beneath the surface. How dare she not obey? Meghan's eyes flicked toward the house manager, then back at Kaitlyn. "Very well," she said, voice measured, calm, and deceptively soft. "But let's be clear. I expect adherence to my standards moving forward. This conversation is not simply about your questions. It is about respect, recognition, and decorum." Kaitlyn lifted an eyebrow. "And if I don't comply?" she asked softly, deliberately. Meghan paused. The silence was loaded, heavy, almost suffocating. Her lips pressed together for a brief moment, then parted in a measured, elegant exhale. "Well," she said finally, voice smooth but firm, "then we will see where that leads." The house manager shifted his weight, the tension in his stance increasing. He knew, as did everyone in the room, that the conversation had just escalated far beyond polite exchanges. Kaitlyn could feel the unspoken stakes rise. Not just the interview, not just the words, but the entire atmosphere. The energy, the balance of power, the subtle battle of wills. And she knew, even in this small, elegant living room, that the first demand, the insistence on "Your Highness," had set off a chain reaction. The kind of chain reaction that changes everything. And she realized, almost immediately, that the next moments would not be easy. They would not be predictable. They would not be ordinary. Because the first demand had been made. The first refusal had been given. And now the real challenge had begun. The tension in the room wasn't going away. It was thickening, growing heavier, and it was about to ignite. But what Meghan did next, her reaction, her subtle recalibration, her next maneuver, would shock everyone present. And it would set the stage for an interview unlike any Kaitlyn had ever conducted. The soft sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the New York townhouse had begun to feel like spotlights trained on a stage. Every detail of the room seemed sharper, every shadow longer, every movement more deliberate. The interview, which should have started with questions about projects, passions, or perspectives, had already spiraled into an unspoken contest of wills. And it all hinged on 3 words, Your Highness. Meghan's demand had hung in the air like an unspoken law. A test, a challenge, a gauntlet thrown, not at Kaitlyn, but at the entire energy of the room. Kaitlyn sat, pen poised above her notebook, feeling the pulse of tension thrum against her skin. She had faced difficult interviews before, celebrities accustomed to drama, politicians trained to spin, authors defending their work. But this was different. This was intimate, private, a performance where the audience consisted of only 3 people, yet the stakes felt monumental. Do you know that feeling when someone expects you to kneel without ever telling you why? When someone demands allegiance in a room so small, it almost feels like the walls are closing in. That was Kaitlyn's reality now. Meghan's posture was impeccable, her smile perfectly rehearsed. But the edges betrayed something that the careful observer could see, a flicker of impatience, a flash of frustration, a glint of anger, so subtle it could have been mistaken for elegance. You will address me as Your Highness, Meghan said, her voice calm, even. But beneath the polished cadence was a clear undertone, insistence, expectation, authority. Kaitlyn blinked. She could feel the weight of the words pressing down, almost physically, as if the room itself demanded compliance. And yet, she kept her gaze steady. I've already stated that I will refer to you as Meghan, she said softly, deliberately, letting the words land like a stone in calm water. That is how I conduct my interviews. The pause that followed was deafening. The house manager, standing rigidly nearby, shifted ever so slightly. His hands, clasped in front of him, betrayed the tiniest hint of tension. He had been trained for etiquette, for deference, for anticipating moments like this. Yet even he seemed momentarily unsettled. Meghan's eyes narrowed. A flash of disbelief crossed her features. You are refusing? She asked. Not aggressively, not angrily, but sharp enough to cut through the polite pretense of civility. Yes, Kaitlyn replied evenly. I'm refusing. I'm addressing you as Meghan because that is appropriate for this conversation, and because respect is mutual. A flicker of tension rippled through Meghan's carefully maintained composure. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, as though steadying herself for the next move. Every muscle in her body suggested control, precision, authority. Yet beneath it, there was a crack. Small, almost imperceptible, but present. Have you ever witnessed someone used to unquestioned reverence experience resistance for the first time? That subtle internal quake, a flicker that betrays insecurity masked by perfection? That was what happened next. Meghan leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on her lap. For a moment, silence reigned, thick and almost unbearable. Then, in a voice that was calm, yet laced with unmistakable edge, she said, Do you realize the implications of refusing my title? Of refusing to call me Your Highness? Kaitlyn tilted her head, considering. The words were loaded, implying consequences, authority, and perhaps subtle threat. But she answered without hesitation. Yes, she said, and I understand them fully. But the terms of this interview are clear. I am here as a journalist. You are here as an interviewee. That is the only protocol I follow. A shadow crossed Meghan's face, quickly masked by a small, polite nod. But the momentary slip was enough. Enough to reveal the first hint of frustration that had been simmering beneath her polished exterior. You are testing me, Meghan said, her voice soft but sharp. And you are doing it deliberately. Perhaps, Kaitlyn replied, voice steady. Or perhaps I am simply being honest. The air in the room thickened. The sun's rays caught on the edges of Meghan's hair, glinting almost like a halo, but the effect was eerie rather than angelic. Every movement, every glance, every breath carried weight. The house manager's eyes darted briefly to Kaitlyn, then back to Meghan, tension coiling in his shoulders. And then, Meghan did something that changed everything. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Kaitlyn's, and spoke with a quiet, sharp intensity that cut through the calm like a knife. I am used to compliance, she said. I am used to being recognized, respected. When someone refuses me, even in a private room, it is unusual. Unusual. The word hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting with invisible intent. It was the first true crack in her composure. The first subtle admission that control, so meticulously maintained, was beginning to slip. Kaitlyn's eyes didn't waver. She met Meghan's gaze evenly, with a calmness that belied the tension suffusing the room. "I understand that," she said. "But respect is earned in conversation, not demanded by a title." The response was precise, measured, calculated. Everything Meghan had expected to hear, and everything she had not. A flicker of surprise crossed Meghan's expression, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest the unspoken truth. She hadn't anticipated this. She hadn't anticipated resistance, calm resistance, direct resistance. And that's when it happened. The first sharp sign of anger. Not explosive, not theatrical, but a tightening of the jaw, a brief narrowing of the eyes, a subtle flare of nostrils. The micro-expressions that betray emotion even when the voice is smooth and composed. For a moment, it seemed as though the room itself had contracted, as though the walls were drawing closer, compressing the tension like a spring about to snap. "You are aware," Meghan said, tone slightly firmer, "that these words carry weight? That the way you speak to me reflects how you perceive me?" "Yes," Kaitlyn said, "and I perceive you as someone entitled to respect, not submission. As someone whose achievements matter, not just your title." The pause this time was longer. The kind of silence where every exhalation seems amplified, where the air is so heavy it almost presses against the skin. Meghan's eyes flickered, scanning Kaitlyn for a crack, a hesitation, a flaw in composure. None came. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first real spark ignited. A subtle shift in Meghan's posture, the crossing and uncrossing of her legs, a micro-movement of her hands. She was beginning to calculate, strategize, reassert control without overt displays. Kaitlyn watched carefully, noting every micro-gesture. Every twitch, every blink, every fleeting expression spoke volumes. This was no longer about titles. This was about power, control, and the psychology of dominance. "You will see," Meghan said softly, voice barely above a whisper. But it carried a weight, a threat wrapped in calm elegance. "There are consequences for ignoring tradition, for refusing respect." Kaitlyn leaned slightly forward, her voice steady, unwavering. "I am not ignoring respect," she said. "I am choosing to address you as a person. That is my principle." The words hung between them like a taut wire stretched tight. Every second that passed carried the potential for escalation. And in that suspended moment, the room itself seemed alive, the air thick with anticipation. The sun casting long shadows, like silent witnesses to the tension. Meghan's hands twitched slightly in her lap. Her lips pressed together for a brief fraction of a second. The first real sign of internal conflict. She exhaled slowly, measured, trying to regain composure, trying to reset the dynamic. But the spark had already ignited. The first demand, "Your Highness," had not been met. The first refusal had been given. And now the air was charged, electrified, ready to explode. Every muscle in the room seemed to respond. The house manager shifted. Kaitlyn's pen hovered over the notebook. Meghan's eyes blazed just beneath the surface of controlled calm. And at that precise moment, it became clear, nothing about this interview would be ordinary. Nothing would proceed according to expectation. The first real confrontation had occurred. And what came next, Meghan's reaction to this refusal, would push the tension into uncharted territory. The moment everything snapped was only moments away. The room held its breath. The air felt tight, almost compressed, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to watch. Meghan sat poised, her perfect composure barely concealing the ripple of frustration underneath. Kaitlyn remained calm, pen hovering above her notebook, recorder ready, eyes steady. The first major confrontation had passed, but the tension was far from resolved. In fact, it had shifted, and that shift triggered the next move. The house manager cleared his throat. A subtle sound, deliberate, precise. Not loud, not brash, but enough to slice through the charged silence of the room. Every journalist has experienced that moment. The unexpected intervention, the third-party presence that can either diffuse or amplify tension. He stepped closer, voice controlled, as if he had rehearsed this scenario countless times in his mind. "Duchess," he said softly, glancing first at Meghan and then at Kaitlyn. Perhaps it would help if we maintained formal address. It is customary, and it ensures comfort in these settings. Customary. Comfort. Two words layered with centuries of expectation. The kind of words designed to realign behavior without raising a hand or snapping a finger. But here's the key. Meghan didn't flinch. She didn't snap. She didn't call him out or redirect attention. She simply raised a hand, almost imperceptibly, a delicate, elegant gesture, and the house manager froze in mid-step. "No, Charles," she said quietly, voice controlled but commanding. "Let me handle this. Let me handle this." Those words carried authority, not just over the house manager, but over the room itself, over the dynamic that had begun to tilt in an unpredictable direction. Meghan was signaling, the narrative is mine to control, and she would not allow a secondary player to mediate. For a moment, Kaitlyn noticed the shift in the manager's posture. He straightened even more, as if bracing against a sudden weight, yet his eyes darted briefly to Kaitlyn. There was something in that glance. Hesitation, recognition, subtle fear. Not of Kaitlyn, necessarily, but of the volatility brewing just beneath Meghan's poised exterior. Meghan exhaled softly, a precise, measured breath. She leaned forward slightly, tilting her head, eyes fixed on Kaitlyn. There was a rhythm to her composure, like a pendulum balancing calm and control. But every pendulum has a moment when it swings too far, when the equilibrium fails. "Your response is noted," Meghan said. "But understand this. The way one addresses me here sets the tone for everything. This is not merely a formality. It is recognition of position, of responsibility, of what I represent." Kaitlyn, steady and deliberate, tilted her head and smiled faintly. "I understand what you represent," she said. "But I also understand that respect is not dictated solely by title. It is earned, maintained, and mutually recognized." The words hit the room like a stone in still water. The subtle shockwaves rippled through the air. Meghan's eyes flickered, sharp and focused. The faintest tightening of her jaw betrayed that the statement had landed. And then the house manager, who had been hovering like a silent sentinel, took a small step back. His presence had been meant to enforce decorum, to act as a buffer, a subtle enforcer of protocol. But Meghan's subtle gesture had removed him from the equation. He was no longer mediator. He was observer. That shift changed everything. You know the feeling when someone attempts to maintain authority over a room and it slips through their fingers despite meticulous planning? That's what had begun here. Meghan leaned back slightly in her chair, hands folded in her lap. Her gaze never wavered from Kaitlyn. Every micro-expression, the faint flare of her nostrils, the subtle narrowing of her eyes, the imperceptible twitch of her lips, told a story that was impossible to ignore. She had demanded, "Your Highness." Kaitlyn had refused, and the house manager's intervention had been rebuffed. Now the room was an arena, silent yet alive with anticipation. Every movement, every breath, every glance was weighted. And Meghan's next words would carry the power to either reassert control or reveal vulnerability. "You are aware," she said slowly, "that in refusing proper address, you are testing boundaries. Boundaries I maintain for reasons beyond mere etiquette. Boundaries that define interactions, decorum, and the structure of this conversation." "Yes," Kaitlyn said, "I am aware. And I am testing boundaries deliberately, because boundaries define the terms of respect, not titles alone." A subtle tension coiled in Meghan's shoulders. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. Not angry, not theatrical, but sharp, precise, deliberate. "Do you truly understand what that means?" she asked. Kaitlyn nodded. "I do," she replied. "And I also understand my own principles. Those principles guide the way I conduct interviews." Meghan's eyes, sharp and piercing, fixed on Kaitlyn with unwavering intensity. The room seemed to constrict around them. Even the polished floors, the minimalist decor, the sunlight spilling across the furniture felt secondary to the silent battle unfolding between the two women. The house manager shifted again. A subtle movement, a micro-adjustment of weight, but it spoke volumes. His role, once a stabilizing presence, was now reduced to a witness of an escalating psychological duel. "You are firm," Meghan said. "I recognize that. But firmness in refusal is unusual, especially in settings such as this." Kaitlyn leaned slightly forward, her pen poised above the notebook. And yet necessary, she said. Because respect must be mutual. Otherwise, it is only compliance. The words landed like a challenge. The room's tension thickened. The house manager's eyes flicked toward Meghan. For a fleeting moment, he seemed uncertain. But Meghan's composure, polished and precise, restored a fragile balance. She exhaled again, softly, slowly. The kind of breath that is intended to smooth over tension, to mask irritation, to convey calm. But the observer could see through it. The micro-tremor in her fingers, the faint tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, all suggested the first cracks of internal frustration. And then she leaned back slightly, giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Very well," she said. "We shall continue. But know this. The tone of this conversation is established by how I am acknowledged." Kaitlyn's eyes flicked toward the house manager. He remained silent, a statue of calm professionalism. But even he was aware. The tension had shifted irrevocably. The intervention that was meant to maintain control had highlighted a fracture in the dynamics. Meghan's authority, her careful orchestration of the room, had been challenged. And the challenge had landed, elegantly and quietly, but unmistakably. The subtle power struggle was now fully visible. Kaitlyn began to take notes, pen moving across the page, recording not just words but gestures, tone, posture, micro-expressions. The house manager shifted his weight again, subtly, as if anticipating the next move. Meghan's eyes never left Kaitlyn, and every second stretched longer, tauter, more charged with unspoken consequences. Because the first demand had been made, the refusal had been given, and the intervention, the attempt to mediate, had been deflected. All that remained now was the reaction that would define the rest of the interview. And you could almost feel it in the room, the tiny, sharp spark that precedes a storm. Meghan's next move, subtle, deliberate, and entirely controlled, would escalate the tension to new heights. But what came next would shock everyone in that townhouse. And it would set the stage for a confrontation that no one in the room would forget. The room seemed smaller now. Every inch of the New York townhouse had contracted, every shadow deepened, every movement became monumental. The air vibrated with anticipation. Meghan sat poised on the sofa, her body a study in control, straight-backed, hands folded neatly in her lap, chin lifted just so. Her gaze remained locked on Kaitlyn, intense, probing, measuring. The house manager hovered near the edge of the room, tense, like a soldier waiting for orders, yet knowing they might never come. And Kaitlyn felt the weight of the moment pressing against her. Every journalist has faced difficult personalities, but nothing like this. Not in private. Not in a room designed to feel intimate and casual, yet suffused with the kind of psychological intensity usually reserved for courtrooms or boardrooms. Meghan's voice was quiet when she spoke. Controlled, refined, precise. "You understand, of course, that the way one addresses me sets the tone for every interaction," she said. Kaitlyn held her gaze. Calm, neutral, firm. "I understand," she said. "But I also understand that the tone of a conversation isn't dictated by title alone. Respect is mutual, not enforced." The words hung in the air like a knife poised midair. For a fraction of a second, Meghan's eyes flickered. Just a tiny micro-expression, a brief narrowing of her gaze, a subtle tightening around the jaw, but it was enough to hint at something behind the calm exterior, something barely contained. Frustration, surprise, maybe even a flicker of anger. And that was the first crack in her carefully curated composure. You've seen it before, haven't you? That moment when someone accustomed to total control suddenly realizes that control is slipping. Their posture may remain perfect, their voice smooth, but the tension under the surface betrays them. The first quiver of impatience. The shadow behind the smile. Kaitlyn had stepped into that space, not intentionally as a provocation, but as a journalist committed to her own principles. And Meghan had noticed. "Are you testing me?" Meghan asked, softly, deliberately, measuring each word. "Perhaps," Kaitlyn replied, calm, steady. "Or perhaps I am simply being honest." The air thickened. The house manager shifted slightly, hands tightening in front of him. He had been trained to anticipate tensions like this, to step in, to redirect, to smooth over discomfort. Yet Meghan's subtle gesture, the lifting of her hand, the silent command to remain quiet, removed him from the equation entirely. She was no longer just the interviewee. She was the conductor of the room, orchestrating every subtle motion, every hesitation, every pause. And Kaitlyn, she was the wall, the journalistic wall, solid, unyielding, professional. She refused to bend, to cave, to perform the ritual expected of her. And in that refusal lay the tension that would define the rest of the interview. Meghan leaned forward slightly, tilting her head, eyes sharp and focused. "You are aware," she said, "that boundaries exist for a reason, that the way one interacts with me is part of a system that has been established, maintained, and respected for years." Kaitlyn's gaze didn't waver. Her pen moved across the page, capturing not just words, but the rhythm, the pauses, the gestures. Every subtle twitch, every carefully measured syllable, every flicker of emotion. "Yes," she said, "I understand boundaries. But I also understand that mutual respect doesn't require adherence to ritual or title. It requires acknowledgement, engagement, and honesty." The words seemed to land like stones thrown into still water. The tension in the room rippled outward, brushing against every surface. Meghan's hands flexed slightly in her lap, the tiniest motion that betrayed internal conflict. Her eyes remained fixed on Kaitlyn, scanning for hesitation, weakness, vulnerability. There was none, and that, perhaps, was the most unnerving realization for Meghan. That Kaitlyn's neutrality, her calm refusal to perform ritualistic deference, was not a challenge that could be easily broken. "You are firm," Meghan said, her tone still soft but edged with subtle intensity. "I recognize that. But firmness in refusal is unusual, especially in settings such as this." Kaitlyn tilted her head. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is necessary. Because respect, to be meaningful, cannot be demanded. It must be given and reciprocated." Another pause, longer this time, almost as if the room itself had inhaled. Meghan's lips pressed together for a brief moment. Her eyes narrowed, scanning Kaitlyn for any sign of weakness. Finding none, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands over her knees, trying to reassert control. But the balance had shifted. The house manager's presence, meant to stabilize, now felt almost redundant. He shifted his weight subtly, observing, silent. He knew the dynamics had changed irrevocably. Meghan's authority was still present, but Kaitlyn's journalistic integrity created a counterweight, a resistance that could not be ignored. Meghan's voice softened, lower now, deliberate. "I am used to compliance. I am used to recognition. When that is withheld, even subtly, it can feel like defiance." Kaitlyn leaned forward, matching Meghan's intensity with calmness. "And yet," she said, "truth and honesty are more powerful than compliance. That is why I am here. To hear your perspective, not to perform rituals of reverence." Meghan's eyes flickered again, just briefly, but enough to show the internal calculation. Her body remained still, face calm, voice measured, but the tension beneath it was palpable. The micro-expressions betrayed the tiny cracks forming in her composure. She exhaled slowly, deliberately, as if trying to smooth the rising frustration. "Very well," she said softly. "We shall continue. But understand this. The tone of this conversation is set by the way I am acknowledged." Kaitlyn's gaze lifted to meet hers. "And I understand that. But acknowledgement does not require adherence to title alone." Another pause. Silence. The house manager shifted slightly, then froze, sensing that his role was now as observer, not enforcer. The room held its breath. Every movement, every breath, every micro-expression had weight, because the first demand had been made. The refusal had been given. And the dynamics had shifted. The journalistic wall had been erected, and Meghan had realized that penetrating it would require more than mere expectation or polite command. The tension thickened, almost tangible. The sun cast long, angular shadows across the room, mirroring the psychological battle unfolding. Every glance, every gesture, every half-smile carried meaning. And Kaitlyn knew, as journalists often do in moments like these, that she was witnessing something rare, something revealing. Not just an interview, but a study in power, perception, and the delicate balance between authority and resistance. And Meghan? She sat poised, elegant, perfect, but internally calculating. Every word, every movement, every breath would be measured against this new variable, resistance. And resistance is never easy to predict, because the moment someone refuses the ritual, the performance falters. And when that happens, all bets are off. The next move, subtle, deliberate, and entirely Meghan's, would escalate the tension to new heights. And what came next would leave the house manager, Kaitlyn, and the fictionalized observer of this scene stunned. The room had transformed into a stage, though there were no cameras, no audience, and no applause. Yet everything in the townhouse seemed amplified. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast sharp, deliberate shadows. The polished floors reflected subtle movements, magnifying them. The air felt electric, almost fragile, as if one misstep could send the tension shattering like glass. Meghan sat on the sofa, composed, elegant, the very image of poise. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingertips brushing together in a delicate pattern that betrayed both control and calculation. Every movement, every tilt of her head, every blink was intentional.